Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the invitation for the Minnesota Historical Society to come here, and that you've come out to listen to me and other people. And I want to talk a little bit about the 9th Minnesota, which is what my book is on. And for me, it's really, I still have kind of goosebumps thinking of what this day is in history. I'm not dealing with Gettysburg, but it's not far from my mind. 150 years ago today was the war could have ended that day. Had Lee won that battle, that war would have ended. It would have made no difference whether Vicksburg had fallen. If Lee had been able to triumph on that field, that would have been the end of the war. The Democratic Party and the anti-war people in the North would not have allowed the war to continue if the Army of the Potomac had been either destroyed or badly damaged. And one thing I think too in terms of Minnesota, and when you think of Gettysburg, you think of the 1st Minnesota, the tremendous record that regiment had. Only regiment to serve in the Eastern Theater between 1861 and 64 from Minnesota, at Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. And you think of that charge on the 2nd of July that regiment made. One single regiment charged and stopped an entire Confederate brigade and helped save the Union position on Seminary Ridge. It was a horrendous cost, over 2/3 killed and wounded in that charge. And then on the 3rd, today, 150 years ago today, the regiment helped to stop Pickett's charge, and one of its men captured the flag of the 28th Virginia, which I understand that the Southerners really want back. But I'm very proud of you up here that you are not giving it back. I think that's wonderful. It should stay in Minnesota to honor Minnesota veterans in the Civil War. And as a lifelong Wisconsinite, I can certainly say that Minnesota, 1st Minnesota stands in the same esteem to me as the Army Brigade does. And if you're from Wisconsin, that's a great compliment. So I'm going to speak today about another Minnesota regiment, and there were other Minnesota regiments. So that's one thing I've noticed, that there isn't an awful lot of information on these other regiments, and that I think is sad, because they had records that were almost, in their own way, as illustrious as the 1st Minnesota, but they just don't have much coverage. And the one I'm going to be talking about is the 9th Minnesota. And it has a reputation in Minnesota military history, but it has a reputation for being the hard luck regiment, where things really went very, very bad. The regiment itself was raised in August 1862, in that second big wave of men that were raised for the Civil War, summer '62. And 150 years ago, it was basically scattered in posts in central Minnesota, watching in case the Dakota Warriors came back. So it didn't go south, it had to stay in Minnesota because of the Dakota Uprising. And what's interesting about the 9th Minnesota is that it never actually even assembled as a regiment until May 1864 in St. Louis. The company's all been split up in different posts and had never gotten together before that. Like nearly all the Minnesota regiments, the 9th Minnesota fought in the Western Theater. In its very first battle, which I'll discuss in detail later, it was like the 1st Minnesota, the only Minnesota unit that was there. And its charge drove back the biggest Confederate brigade, drove it back a quarter of a mile, and actually stopped its attack and kept it out of that portion, that part of the battle. And then afterwards it was in the rear guard and protected the rest of the Union force as it was exiting the field. Unlike Gettysburg, this first battle that the 9th Minnesota fought in was probably the worst and the most shameful Union defeat of the war. And there was a lot of competition for that title, but I think Bryce's Crossroads has to be given it. A ruthless 3-day pursuit, the Federal force was decimated, over 1,600 prisoners were captured, including 235 from the 9th Minnesota. And the experiences that these men had in Andersonville and other Confederate prisons in the next 10 months was hellish and deadly. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. But right now I wanted to say here that if you were in the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg, at that terrible battle at Gettysburg, and went through the hell that they did in terms of combat, you had a better chance of surviving than you would if you'd been a prisoner of the 9th Minnesota taken after the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. The 1st Minnesota lost 79 men killed or died of wounds out of about 400. Of the 235 prisoners of the 9th Minnesota, 139 of them died. either in the camps or right after they got home. The death rate was slightly over 60%, one of the highest in the whole Union Army for prisoners. In one area, though, the 9th Minnesota proved unique. It did something that the 1st Minnesota didn't do, and something that nobody else did. And this relates to slavery. And slavery was the central issue of the war and the cause of the war. Right now, it's very fashionable for people to point to states' rights or we didn't fight for slavery. They sort of follow the Southern lost cause mythology that was created in the 1890s and beyond. It's the mythology that demonizes the radical Republicans, says Lincoln was a dictator who didn't follow the Constitution and such. I very much disagree with that. I'll give you my I'm a proud conservative Republican who's an outright and complete supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the radical Republicans. I sent my manuscript to the Missouri chapters to a Missouri historian named James Denny, who reviewed my manuscript to make sure it was accurate. He's a Missouri state historian and an expert in Missouri in the Civil War. And he told me it's the only Civil War book he had ever read where the radical Republicans were the heroes. So I noticed something's a little different there. And I think it's indeed a profound tragedy that the ideals of the radical Republicans did not prevail during the Reconstruction, because I think they would have done a lot better job helping the freed slaves become more than just sharecroppers under the same old Southern aristocracy. And I do talk a little bit about that in the book as well, because there's a nice section in the book, I think, that I was surprised to see on the occupation, 9th Minnesota's role in the occupation after the war. So the fundamental question is, why did Union soldiers fight? Was it to preserve the Union or to end slavery? In 1861 and 1862, the overwhelming evidence is that they fought to preserve the Union and to punish the rebellious South. There's no doubt about that. To them, slavery was only a side issue. They were more frightened of the expanse of Southern oligarchy. They were really worried about the loss of the territories to slavery if slavery was allowed to advance. As with other soldiers, though, Union soldiers, the motives of the Minnesota soldiers was very complex. A captain of the 7th Minnesota later declared, that was enlisted in 1862, that the reason for the enlistments was, quote, because our flag had been insulted and fired upon. Slavery, quote, had but little to do with enlistments, for a large portion of our soldiers were Democrats who either would not have stayed a day had it been understood that they were fighting to free slaves. The captain estimated that at least half of his company were Democrats. Yet the concern for the plight of slaves was soon evident among Minnesota soldiers. In December 1861, in Maryland, General Willis Gorman, who had previously been colonel of the 1st Minnesota, declared, quote, if rebels or anyone else gets a slave returned to them to their masters during this rebellion, they'll have to find it some other instrument to perform this work other than myself. Every fugitive slave that has come into my brigade has been fed and cared for as we understand the orders of the War Department. And Sergeant James Wright, who was a memoirist of the 1st Minnesota, very famous, he also concurred. Quote, though none of us had any inclination to pose as abolitionists, I think we were all glad when a slave went free, most certainly if his owner was a secessionist. In September 1862, in northwest Alabama, Lieutenant Colonel Lucius Hubbard of the 5th Minnesota discovered, quote, quite a business in the confiscation of slave property. And he, quote, derived much private satisfaction from it. By October 1863, when the 1st Minnesota reached Missouri, Emancipation Proclamation had been in effect for nearly a year. But the proclamation only freed slaves in the rebellious South, the slaves that had been part of the states that left the Union. Exempted were the loyal border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And the reason was because President Lincoln didn't think he had the constitutional authority to free slaves in those states. He was also very reluctant to antagonize those border states because everything was on the edge with them. He famously said that he would like to have God on his side, but he must have Kentucky. And he could have said the same thing about Missouri, too. So here you have the 9th Minnesota coming down in October 1863 to Missouri, and they have to maintain slavery. That's the federal Union Army policy. You must maintain slavery. And the evidence is completely in that they didn't like it. They arrived in Missouri during a time of great political tumult. Missouri Unionist politics were the radicals versus the conservatives. Both of them were unionists, both of them believed in emancipation, but the radicals wanted to do it right away, and the conservatives wanted to do it gradually, perhaps even as late as 1870. There was an important state election set for November 1863, and the radical victory, if they had won, they would be in a position possibly to have emancipation in Missouri without compensation for the owners. And these newly arrived Minnesotans, they weighed in on this. This is one of the real surprises in researching this, is these fellows really talked about the politics because they had this impulse because of what they could see around them. So you get a tremendous amount of information from these people. Letters home, letters to newspapers, just statements in general. And from what the original sources show, the 9th Minnesota strongly favored the Republicans in general and the radicals in particular. One officer wrote home, quote, "The radical immediate emancipation sentiments that are daily uttered and indeed are triumphant here in Missouri would shock the sensitive nerves of some of our tender-footed Republicans of Minnesota." He supported how they dealt with slavery, quote, "boldly, fairly, and squarely." The Minnesotans were even more disgusted by slavery when they actually saw it in operation. One young soldier wrote home from Jefferson City, "We have seen enough to still more convince me that it is of the greatest evil." And many, if not most, of the 9th Minnesota supported immediate emancipation. My book shows how 38 men met the test that transformed those ideals into action. And this is the so-called Otterville Outrage. I have a map from the book. Otterville is along the Pacific Railroad. I always thought that was kind of funny. The Pacific Railroad, this thing is anywhere near the Pacific. It's very optimistic. But Otterville was about 45 miles west of Jefferson City. And the 9th Minnesota went first to St. Louis and then to Jefferson City, and then part of it was sent to Otterville to guard a railroad bridge that had been burned. There were two companies there of the 9th Minnesota, Company C from Mower County and Company K from Winona and Wabasha. And on the morning of November 11th, 1863, normal morning, kind of cold, the weather was actually fairly cold then, an escaped slave came into the camp of these two companies. And who he was and why he came to be there is one of the central portions of the book. His name was John. He was from a farm. His family were slaves on a farm just south of Georgetown. You can see it north of Sedalia there. And his master was Charles Willis Carter Walker, who was a Kentuckian. And what's really remarkable is that the slaves in that part of Missouri were not on plantations like the ones along the Missouri River. They were on fairly small farms, and they worked with their masters as farmers. And what's fascinating too is this was a family of relatives. You had two brothers, you had their wives, you had two young sisters, and you had one of the brothers' 5 young children. So these 11 people were kin, which is kind of remarkable. And Charles Walker was one of those that was very worried that Missouri was going to emancipate the slaves. And he wanted to get his money's worth out of them. So he told them on November 10th that they're going to be going on the train. And John knew that this was to take them to Kentucky to sell them and split them up and sell them, because there was still a fairly active slave market in Kentucky. There was no active slave market in Missouri at that time. So what John did is he escaped. He resisted and he escaped. And his brother also resisted, but John didn't know this yet. His brother resisted and was killed by the slave owner. And the slave owner did take the remaining parts of the family, the women and the children, to the train the next day. All John knew was that that they were going to be on a train that was going to be going east the next morning. What he did is he raced all night in the darkness. There was no moon that night. He raced all the way from just south of Georgetown to Otterville, about 16, 17 miles. And he had to do it because he had to get there before that train passed through Otterville. He knew there was a Union camp there, and he went to that camp, and he figured that was his last chance to stop this tragedy. He came into the camp. He was brought forward to Company C headquarters. The captain, his name was Edwin Ford, and Ford knew that he had no right under any obligation, no law, under military law. All he could do was neither interfere or aid or hinder an escaped slave. All he could do was politely usher him on his way. And what Ford did is remarkable. He told his NCOs that I'm going to be taking a walk out of camp with the other officers from this company, and if you boys want to do something, you do it. And they did it. They organized a group of 38 guys, and this is the fellow who led it, Sergeant Frank Merchant. We have a wonderful image of him that was taken by Joel Whitney, St. Paul. So very, very fortunate. He was a captain at that time in 1865, but in 1863 he was a sergeant. And he organized that force of 38 men, and they marched down to that train, and they were waiting when the train came in. Now I'm going to talk a little later about how John managed to persuade these men, but he did. And it's so incredibly remarkable. So when the train came in, there were 38 Union soldiers with their muskets on the platform of the depot, and they started searching the train. And they found the family. They found the family in one of the box cars, because you never have a slave ride in a passenger car. And they found them tied up, and they untied them, and they freed them. And on that train was Walker, but Walker did not come forward at all. I think he realized this was not a good move. And the one that did come forward was the conductor, Charles White. And he ran back and said, "What are you doing? You have no right to do this. Where's your officers?" And one of these men said, "We're all officers," which is really wonderful. And there also were two fairly senior Missouri militia officers on the train, including the sub-district commander, so the overall commander of that particular area. And he protested and was ignored. They took the family off and let the train proceed. They actually had the train under gunpoint, and the conductor had ordered the engineer to keep going, but when he saw those muskets raised at him, he said he wouldn't do it. And there was a young soldier whose letter I found in the Minnesota Historical Society. He was 19 years old, named David Felch, and he wrote that they were about ready to put a mini ball into the boiler if this train had started to go. So these people were very serious about this. So John's family was liberated, and the train went to the camp. It was about 2 miles from the camp. Was 2 miles from town. They went in, and the two officers went and talked to the camp commander, the captain of Company K, David Wellman. He knew anything about this. He was very unhappy, and they reversed the train and went back to where the men were standing, because they had started to walk back to camp. By that time, they'd seen that the train was coming back, and they got the family into the brush. And David Felch talks about how he crawled into the brush, and he was ready to shoot anybody who came into the brush after that family. There was a tremendous uproar at headquarters. They ended up arresting the liberators, charged them with mutiny. They were confined in Jefferson City and charged for 6 weeks. And this was a unique action in the Civil War. I did a lot of research on this. And not only did they shelter an escaped slave, but they rescued his family in defiance of military orders. The case was sent up to St. Louis, but there was no action. They were never brought to trial. They were held until January 8th, finally released at the behest of the local commander, the general commanding that district. Only afterwards did this come to the attention of the senator from Minnesota, Morton Wilkinson, and he brought it up on the floor of the Senate, and the Senate passed a resolution asking for why did this happen, and that produced some documents. But by that time, it was moot because the men had been released. And this is a incident that's long been neglected, but it says much about the Union Army policy in the border states. The Otterville outrage, as I discovered, was not so much like what was going on in the Civil War, but it was very much like what was happening in the northern states after the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted in 1850. You ended up having what they call these forcible slave rescues, where black and white citizens would go into courtrooms and such, and they would prevent slaves from being sent back south to their masters. There was a famous one in Wisconsin. It was a fellow named Joshua Glover, who was an escaped slave from Missouri, was found in 1854 by his master and a couple of federal marshals in Racine. And they realized that the local populace was getting very angry about this. They took him to Milwaukee, but by the time they got him to Milwaukee, they'd already been spread there, and they stormed the jail and released him and got him up to Canada. Well, that's the type of thing the Otterville outrage was like. And I mentioned about John as a person. Look at these outrages, or these forcible slave rescues, and you've got some eloquent abolitionist orator whipping the people up. You've got all of this, this rhetoric. All John had was himself. What did he say to those Minnesotans? He had maybe 15 minutes to persuade them to do something. And he did it. I mean, I would love to know what this man had to say, but it's lost in history. Now, why did I get into this whole thing? Why have I researched, the Otterville outrage? Well, I started doing some family history about 12 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, and I discovered, see, I'm a World War II historian, and I sort of left Civil War alone. I discovered that one of my great-great-uncle was one of the liberators. And so this all came from trying to find more about him. And this, in terms of history, this is kind of the kiss of death. But, I'm writing this book because of my glorious ancestor did all of this, and you don't tend to have a tendency to trust the objectivity of someone like that. So you have to judge, if you read my book, whether you think I'm objective enough. The thing that surprised me is I thought that these people would never emerge from the blank of official documents, very little on them. But the amount of information I got on these individual liberators was absolutely incredible. It kept growing. And that's why I wrote a book instead of just an article. I planned for just an article on this thing, and I just got more and more information, and I couldn't believe it was actually out there. I discovered that the story of these liberators and of the 9th Minnesota was much more than just the Otterville outrage. The rest of the war was very hard on them. Of the 38 liberators, only 14 were still in the ranks at the end of the war. One had been killed in action, one had died of wounds, one had died of disease, and 6 perished because of rebel imprisonment. There was at least one liberator wounded in action in every action the regiment fought after Otterville. And at the end of May 1864, the 9th Minnesota left Missouri and they were on their way to Arkansas, but they stopped at Memphis. They were ordered to stop at Memphis. And they were grabbed by the local commander, had the authority to grab any unit that went through, and he grabbed the 9th Minnesota. And he says, as luck would have it, said General Washburn, the 9th Minnesota was available to join an expedition into northeast Mississippi. And if it was luck for Washburn, it was a terrible tragedy for the 9th Minnesota. The 9th Minnesota took part in one of the most strangest actions in Civil War history, and that's the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. And that's the second grand section of this book. Map. That's the map of the expedition from Memphis to the X is Bryce's Crossroads. And this is the second great portion of the book, which I go into great detail. I basically had to reinterpret the battle because it's very poorly known what the 9th Minnesota did. You, those who have researched the Civil War, know that everybody goes to the official records first when they want to see some unit report. Well, the 9th Minnesota's report doesn't appear in the official records. It appears in the state history that was published in 1890. So most historians who've dealt with Bryce's Crossroads never used it. The commander was Brigadier General Samuel Sturgis. He had about 8,300 men, mixed cavalry and infantry. He had 22 guns and 150 wagons, which is not a good thing when you're going on an expedition like this. The objective was to defeat or at least tie up Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry. And that was his lair up in northeast Mississippi towards Corinth. The problem is that Sturgis didn't have any clue what he was supposed to do. And that's not a good thing when you're fighting someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the roughest and toughest Confederate general. I call him a Confederate Achilles, and I think he really was, in the true sense. The expedition left Memphis on June 1st, moved southeast into Mississippi. Rainy weather and hesitant moves. The huge wagon train was a ball and chain. The weather was terrible. They couldn't advance very far. They didn't try to advance very far. And by June 10th, they'd only gotten about 100 miles. That's 10 days to go 100 miles. It's not really good. And that day, Sturgis was anxious to bring Forrest to battle. He rushed his cavalry out ahead, and the weather was horribly hot and humid, nearly 100 degrees, and no wind. Even Confederates, even hardened Confederates thought it was like the worst day they'd ever seen. It was just unbelievably bad. The infantry, of course, would be hard-pressed to keep up, but Sturgis didn't seem to care about that. It was a horrible blunder. And one of the worst blunders of all was that part of the road they went through a morass. And he led that whole force through that morass. It took time to get the one cavalry horse actually drowned when it fell off into the mud. And it took the wagon train several hours to get through it. When the men went through, they were all covered with mud, the infantry. He didn't know, but if you just looked a little around, there was a completely dry detour that went a quarter of a mile to the west and around and met the road back where there was no morass. Now, the Confederates knew that, but he didn't. That was a terrible blunder. After crossing Tishomingo Creek, there was the fighting at Bryce's Crossroads. That's the monument today at Bryce's Crossroads. The Union cavalry got into trouble. They ran in the forest and they didn't push. Forrest had just enough men as he brought his men up to be able to hold them off. And Forrest was very eager to fight despite being outnumbered. And instead of withdrawing the horsemen, Sturgis pushed the infantry ahead. He had them double quick for up to 2 to 3 miles off and on. Then fell out in droves. There's an indication maybe if some units lost maybe a third of their strength, these guys fell out with heat, well, not so much heat stroke probably, but heat exhaustion. They were just, it was like a battle had been fought and these men were just scattered on the roads to get there. The 9th Minnesota was the last infantry regiment to come up, and it was the reserve. And at that time, Sturgis lost control completely. What he did was he replaced the cavalry with the infantry, but then he had no plan as to what to do. But of course, Forrest had a plan. This is the perimeter. In green is the Union, red are the Confederates, and that's Forrest's attack. He planned originally to attack not only against the Union right, which is on the lower part of that, but also against the Union left. His plan was to fix the Union left and then punch through with the right. But his attack didn't get going fast enough. But the main attack was bad enough. The 9th Minnesota was brought up. That entire wing, the right wing of the Union forces fell back. 93rd Indiana, 114th Illinois. They were in bad shape. This is the situation when the 9th Minnesota came up. And they're the ones that make the counterattack. They were brought up as a support for the faltering brigade. They ambushed Forrest's biggest brigade. They allowed the Confederates to come up within about 30 yards, then they stood up and gave them a volley. That was absolutely incredible. They just blew away a good portion of the Confederate line. And then they charged and they chased that entire brigade back. Only a small part of it went forward, Confederate brigade went forward under Tyler there. At the same time, Company D under Osgrim Scarrow, and you can see where I say Company D or Scarrow, they held the flank for the next 90 minutes against some of Forrest's best troops. It was all for naught. The rest of the Forrest attack went in, and you can see it starting to go in there, and it absolutely crushed the Union left. The guys were just so tired, it just for the most part melted away. And what they ended up doing was they ended up trying to build a line on the other side of Tishomingo Creek. They sent the 9th Minnesota off first. And the 9th Minnesota went in perfect order. In fact, it's even remarked in sources. But the rest of it collapsed behind it, and it was sort of like the tail of a comet. The 9th Minnesota never broke or retreated without orders. In the rear guard, it made several stands west of the creek along with the 114th Illinois and the brave 59th U.S. Colored Infantry. But every Union line was flanked and forced to retreat. The soldiers were exhausted. They were dispirited, not the 9th Minnesota, but the other fellows. And they left all their food there. They just were continually pushed back as Forrest would not let go. And at that marshy point in the road that I mentioned where they hadn't done the proper checking, it ended up being blocked. They got a few wagons across and maybe one gun. When the 9th Minnesota got there, late that night, there were over 100 wagons just in a row waiting to cross, and nearly 20 guns, like about 18 guns, had to be left behind. It was, wrote one Illinois sergeant, a gulf of mud and water, the whole passage jammed with a mass of men, horses, wagons, ambulances, and artillery plunging and floundering in the abyss. Carriages dashing recklessly into each other, getting smashed up and turned over, the drivers yelling, lashing, swearing, and making the night hideous. And the 9th Minnesota was the last unit to cross that marsh. It was early on the next day, the June 11th. And this is the indications of the retreat. They went back to Memphis. Some of those guys went back in like 2 days. What took them 10 days to come out, they were back in Memphis in 2 days. The ones that could go fast enough or had horses. It was that kind of retreat. It was just every man for himself, except the 9th Minnesota and a few other units. Union soldiers had little ammunition and food, hadn't eaten all day. Some tossed away their guns, most stripped away off their accoutrements. The trouser legs, what they found their trouser legs were so encrusted with mud that they cut them off like here, because they really had no way to march. It was so painful. Those with horses outstripped those afoot, and there were men who grabbed the horses' tails and held on for dear life and had the horse drag them or hold on to them for miles and miles and miles. There was one fellow from 9th Minnesota who was on the move nearly the whole time between the end of the battle and the next evening. He figured he went 57 miles. And people they just fell out. The people that couldn't do it couldn't stay up. Major William Markham of the 9th Minnesota, who was a very interesting character and a very good man, who wrote a series of letters for the entire war to the Rochester City Post under the pseudonym High Private. I was very glad to discover those. He wrote, quote, "Our poor exhausted footsore boys, many a poor fellow I looked at and wished I could have it in my power to help them." And Forrest won another action at Ripley. You can see that north of Bryce's Crossroads. And he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. One Union column of around 5,000 men virtually disintegrated. It was every man for himself. Many of the men went into the brush. The majority of the 9th Minnesota was along in that column. And again, they too also took to the brush. There was another column, and this is led by Colonel Alexander Wilkin. Wilkin was he was well known in the territory. He had been in the Army during the Mexican War. He commanded Company A of the 1st Minnesota, took them to Bull Run, was promoted into the 2nd Minnesota as a major and lieutenant colonel, and became colonel of the 9th Minnesota in August '62. He was a very, very interesting man. He was extremely tough. He was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. He killed a fellow officer in the Mexican War in a duel, and I wonder if it was something to do with his size. I didn't have the guts to do this in the book, but I'll tell you this. I really describe him as a ferocious hobbit. If you would think of a ferocious hobbit, it would be Alexander Wilkin. One Illinois soldier whom he saved during the retreat called him a splendid little man. Wilkin was killed in the very next battle that they fought at Tupelo, July 1864. He is the highest ranking Minnesota officer to fall in the Civil War. There's a statue of him in the rotunda. He deserves to be better known because he's the only one that came through Bryce's Crossroads with his reputation enhanced, which is a pretty good thing. And the 9th Minnesota itself had a wonderful reputation. They were, their fellow soldiers were very, very pleased with them. Like I said, the 9th Minnesota's casualties at Bryce's Crossroads were 262, or 41% of the strength. 235 of them were captured. And that's the highest single loss for a Minnesota unit in the Civil War for a specific battle that did not involve the simple surrender of a unit. There were more surrendered at Murfreesboro in the 3rd Minnesota, but their colonel rather got cashiered for it. Liberator David Felch, who I'd mentioned being at Otterville, wonderful collection of letters at the Minnesota Historical Society. He was very shocked by the appearance of his close friend and fellow liberator, Latham D. Stewart. Stewart, quote, looked like a skeleton. He was shoeless, his feet were all raw, and his pants and shirt were nearly all tattered off. Even so, Felch wrote, many others suffered worse than him. A great many had on only their drawers and a part of a shirt. It was a horrible sight. And these Union veterans at Bryce's Crossroads, they never forgot Sturgis. In fact, even right after the battle, they were actually accusing him of deliberately throwing the battle, which is not true. He did mainly because of his, well, it's hard to say. I think he lost his nerve, and he did fairly well in the Indian Wars, but he just couldn't cope with someone like Forrest. In 1882, as a colonel, 1882, as a colonel in the regular army, Sturgis was named governor of the National Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. And that action so angered these veterans of Bryce's Crossroads that one of them started a petition drive asking for him to be relieved of his military post and investigated by Congress. And they got 50 officers and 500 enlisted men to sign that petition. And what that did was make a tremendous tremendous amount of excellent source material on the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads, because these fellows they wrote up what they thought of the battle. And there's several Minnesotans who wrote as well, and it's very, very valuable. The third major part of the book is the prison experience. The 9th Minnesota's prisoners at Andersonville and other prisons, and how they came to die or were exchanged or lived to be exchanged. I cover in detail how they got to prison, what the experience was in prison, and how they were exchanged, the exchange process, and what happened to them when they went home. And the biggest surprise, again, was the tremendous richness of the original sources. There were memoirs, diaries, letters, newspaper accounts, and pension files, nearly all of which have never been used by anybody in any history. He was able to tell the tragic story of Bryce's Crossroads, these people who were captured at Bryce's Crossroads, but in the voices of the Minnesotans and of the other men from other states that were captured with them. And this book, I'm proudly say, is unique in Civil War literature because it's the first one to follow a particular large group of men through the entire Confederate prison system. The men from the 9th Minnesota were held in Andersonville and Savannah and Millen in Georgia, Mobile and Cahaba in Alabama, Charleston and Florence in South Carolina, and Salisbury in North Carolina. It's amazing how many hard journeys that these men had to make from prison to prison, and just to get exchanged. There were situations where because they were retreating from Sherman's advance in Georgia, they took these men, or some of these men, down to southwest Georgia, and they made them march 60 miles. And they had no clothes. A lot of them didn't have any shoes, and it was cold in December. 60 miles to where the railroad was that could take them back to Andersonville. And there's just heart-rending accounts of that march. There were men that were so hungry that they foraged where the animals were fed and picked up the kernels of corn that they found there. And there was a situation where they had to actually be, in certain instances, be prodded by bayonets and the skin broken before these guys would actually move. You can imagine there were men that didn't survive that march. As many as 45,000 Union prisoners went through Andersonville, and nearly 13,000 died there. This is between February 1864 and April 1865. Perhaps 250, 275 were from Minnesota, so a very, very small amount. Of those, about 207 from the 9th Minnesota. Now, 72 men from the 9th Minnesota died there, and between 9 and 10 from the other Minnesota regiments. And so that was just a small fraction of the entire prison population. Yet Minnesota's contribution is of real importance. The chief hospital clerk, his name was E.L. Clapp, was the regimental sergeant major of the 9th Minnesota. He kept records, and he wrote a book a privately printed book after he came back in 1865 on Andersonville. And the head of the burial detail was the first sergeant of Company C, Alonzo Avery, and he likewise kept records. He published an account of it in the newspapers when he was exchanged in 1865. There's a lot of care there in trying to figure out who was lost at Andersonville. They really tried to figure things out. You've heard of Dorrance Atwater, who was the clerk, prisoner clerk who kept the records of every single man who died at Andersonville. Tremendous record. But there are also Minnesotans who were doing the same thing, but in a much limited sense. My research on Andersonville was also aided by official records and also experts like Jack Lundquist of Minneapolis, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was the Minnesota expert on Andersonville. There's still many, many gaps. I discovered one as an example. There was a man captured from the 9th Minnesota, who's from Mankato, captured at Bryce's Crossroads. His name was Hugh Roberts. If you look in the records, they have no idea what happened to him. It's just blank. I was going through an account by an Indiana soldier. It was published in 1934, and he kept a diary, and he noted that Hugh Roberts was his bunkmate at Cahaba in Alabama, and that Hugh Roberts died on, I think it was like the 9th of October, 1864. And that's the only record of what happened to Hugh Roberts is in that source. And if you know about the Sultana, which was that steamship that had all the prisoners from the South in April '65 that blew up off of Memphis. Well, it turns out this Indiana soldier was too sick to go on the Sultana, so he gave his diary to his friend. The Indiana soldier did not survive his trip on a different ship to St. Louis, but his friend was on the Sultana, and when the ship blew up, he went in the water and he saved the diary. And that's the only reason we know what happened to Hugh Roberts. There's so many gaps like that in the Civil War, missing in action. Those captured at Bryce's Crossroads came into Andersonville in June with very little. They had been repeatedly robbed by Confederates who, they took everything. Their accoutrements, their best hats. If they had shoes, they took their shoes. It's just incredible. Often they came in just with a torn shirt and cut off trousers and nothing else. And they were the poorest prisoners in Andersonville. Even the other prisoners pitied them. I mean, I was shocked. These poor guys came in stripped. That's what somebody wrote in his diary when these fellows came into Andersonville. I could spend the entire evening talking about the horrible conditions in Andersonville, and the book, it makes very hard reading in that regard. The prisoners were in really dire shape. They were crowded in with lack of shelter, adequate food, and appalling sanitation, and it was almost beyond belief when you actually read what happened. These were actual death camps, as far as I'm concerned. And it necessarily wasn't the fault of the Confederates, it was more the fault of the Confederate hierarchy rather than someone like Captain Wirtz, who was the commander of the inner prison in Andersonville and was the scapegoat and was later hung. I can't really fault him. He tried his best. His problem was he had an unfortunate personality, and he swore a lot, and they all remembered him. So he was fingered as the culprit, but it wasn't really true. There were they did have a separate hospital. There were 35 men from the 9th Minnesota Hospital. 9th Minnesota were admitted into that hospital. And fortunately, the hospital record survived. And that, of course, was compiled by our Minnesotan. And of the 35, only 2 ever walked out again. The rest of them died in the hospital. And those 2 men died within a month of the time they came home in 1865, both of them. So there's no account of a 9th Minnesota man in the hospital. Certain records show that certain groups of prisoners were kept together. From the 9th Minnesota, you had 2 pairs of fathers and sons. 3 of the 4 died. You had several pairs of brothers. In no case did both of them return from imprisonment. Things were so bad in Confederate captivity that 5 members of the 9th Minnesota and 2 Minnesotans from other regiments resorted to the desperate expediency of joining the Confederate Army to try to save their lives. Now stay tuned for that, because that's the subject of my next book. I'm writing a book specifically just on those 7. So 7 men. And I'm going to show you to conclude here, I'm going to show you a few images of Andersonville as it was and what it is today. And we can talk about it a little bit. That's the layout of Andersonville Prison. And what's always kind of fun is when you see maps of Andersonville, they're maps of a composite time from February 64 until the end, and things are moved around and such. My dear wife did the map that shows what it was like when the men came in June 1864. You can see the 2 gates on the west, the north gate and the south gate, and how the camp is arranged, the railroad. Little town of Andersonville is on the left, and the roads there. And this is a map, this is a photograph of Andersonville today. From looking over the south wall, it's a hill, and there's a indention, and then there's a long slope up, and that camp was on that slope. And you can see the area what's there is part of the stockade around the north gate has been reconstructed today. This is a very moving place to go to. I urge you to have an opportunity to go to Andersonville Prison to see that site today. This is a picture of the reconstruction of the inner north gate, where the men were admitted in 1864. They brought them in through both gates. And that line, that sort of odd line, those what looks like railings, that's the dead line. You don't put one bit of yourself across that dead line, you'll be shot instantly by a guard that's in the guard tower. There's a series of guard towers along. One guy came in 1864, one of the Bryce's Crossroads prisoners, not from Minnesota, but from Ohio. He went down to the creek. There's a creek that cuts the camp in half between the north and south gates. Reached in to grab some water, and because he reached his hand across the dead line, the sentry fired, and the bullet hit 2 other men. And these other prisoners were so angry they beat this poor Ohioan nearly to death. So it's just a terrible, terrible place. Now that's a picture taken in August 1864 from the parapet over the north gate. A Confederate cameraman came in and took a series of incredibly valuable pictures. The only pictures I think of a Confederate camp in operation. You could see what that was like. There was almost no shelter. You could see what the men like, and all those men that you could see in the picture would have been better off in terms of clothing than the 9th Minnesota men were. Evidently they're waiting for the ration wagon to come in, because that would come in the north gate in the later afternoon. And this is a picture looking across from east, looking over the east, where the east wall would have been, over across to where that little construction is of the what's now the reconstructed north wall. That would all have been, of course, would have been stockade. And you can get an idea of the slope. And that little white structure is Providence Spring. And that's a spring that came, the water was terrible. Try to get water in Andersonville. They had a creek that went through that was just total filth. In fact, the Confederates actually dumped their garbage into the creek before it got to the camp. And it was just awful. And there were some men that were able to dig wells, but very few men were able to get that. There were guys who had to go down to that creek, and that's where they got their water. And some of them, would drink as little as they possibly could. And this is in the middle of summer, hot Georgia summer, just unbelievable. Now this is a view by the Confederate photographer from the east wall looking into the camp. You can see the slope. You see these structures. They're called shebangs. They're made out of tents and whatever wood they could get, just dig themselves into the ground. And that's part of the reconstruction of the northeast corner of Andersonville. And those are a few shebangs. And the historians will come in and they will give lectures as to what life was like there. And you can see the pigeon roosts on top where the guards would watch in. And all night they would sound off every hour, post such and such, all is well, everything like that. One of the Minnesotans wrote that one of the things he couldn't believe in Andersonville was when he got into the first night, he couldn't believe all the groans. It kept him awake, all the people that were moaning and groaning and just in terrible distress. That's the cemetery, that's the burial. That was in August 1864. They dug a trench and then they just lined them in shoulder to shoulder. There were times where there were over 100 buried in one day. There were times where they couldn't bury them fast enough, they didn't get buried until the next day. What people don't realize is that the record that survives, the burial record that survived for Andersonville, those graves are all numbered. And it has survived as to if they knew who they were, and they were very conscientious about this because a lot of it was done by prisoners, they put the name on. But it's just amazing. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like. There was one day where 4 men from the 9th Minnesota died on that same day, September 7th, 64. And that's what this cemetery looks like today, these rows upon rows upon rows, so close together. And you could see in the center there's a man named Zara Frisbee. Can you read his name? Zara Frisbee was a liberator who died in the hospital in August 1864. He was buried on August 19th, but I really don't know if he died that day or not, because that was a time when there were so many deaths. That's the Minnesota Memorial that's at Andersonville. They put it up in 1916. And it's in a part of the more modern cemetery. Andersonville became a national cemetery very early, and then they have continued to put burials in there. And so that's why the graves aren't so close, because that was done after, those burials were made after the war. Here's another look at that portion of the cemetery. You can see the Minnesota Memorial in the distance. You can see the graves in front, and one of the graves in front is the grave of someone named Nicholas Landon of the 9th Minnesota. I have no idea why he got there and what happened to him. He was someone who probably escaped and was found dead somewhere somewhere else in Georgia and brought to Andersonville right after the war, but I have no idea what happened to him. I would love to know. Now we're going to talk a little bit about John Morrison, who was my great-great-uncle. Oh, but I want to say one thing first before I do that. Just to give you a final word, I think, about the prisoners of the 9th Minnesota who died in Andersonville and other places. There was a Minnesota historian, you all certainly know of him, named William Watts Falwell, wrote one of the finest, probably one of the finest histories of Minnesota. And this is what he said about the 9th Minnesota. Had these men fallen on the battlefield, a monument or at least a tablet in the rotunda of the Capitol would commemorate their gallantry. The writer of these lines offers his humble tribute of gratitude to these men of Minnesota who gave up their lives and strength in the cause of their country as surely as if they had fallen charging a rebel division in battle. Now, if you remember, I came up with, and got into this whole thing doing research on John Morrison, my great-great-uncle. He was a liberator. He fought at Price's Crossroads, and he was captured. And Minnesota records state that he died on October 31st, 1864, while a prisoner of war at Savannah, Georgia. Now, it's a little suspicious because it turns out that 5 men from his company are listed as dying on the 31st of October, 1864 at Savannah. They really had no idea what happened to them. They arbitrarily gave a date and place so that their widows could get their pensions. It's now a great personal satisfaction to me to discover the truth about John Morrison. John Morrison went to Andersonville in late June. I found out because of the timing, he was one of the last to be captured. He almost got away. He was probably the last liberator to be captured, who was from Bryce's Crossroads. In early September, he was sent to Charleston along with only a very few men from the 9th Minnesota. A month later, he was transferred to the huge camp at Florence, South Carolina. And Florence is a clone of Andersonville, except that instead of hot, it was cold because it was the fall of 1864. And the men had to huddle there in cold muck because a lot of the area was marsh. So it's an absolutely terrible place. There are men who said that Florence was worse than Andersonville, men had been in both places. On November 11th, 1864, John Morrison died from scurvy. I know this because his widow's pension gives that date and place. And then I found 2 other sources that confirm it. One, turns out that there were clothes issued by the U.S. Sanitary Commission at Florence, and I found out that John Morrison was issued clothes there, so I knew he had them. And then it turns out that one of the fellows who was with him in the 9th Minnesota, who was not a liberator, but he was captured, was a neighbor, and he's from western Winona County. When the estate was probated in 1867, the widow's estate, he wrote an affidavit talking about being with John Morrison at Florence, South Carolina, who was with him when he died. So John Morrison died on November 11th, 1864, exactly a year to the day that he helped free John's family in Missouri. He left a widow, 2 daughters, and a son. Over 2,700 Union prisoners are buried at Florence. It's now a national cemetery. They were systematically interred in rows and numbered graves, just like we saw for Andersonville. Each grave had a number, and they had a book that gave the name. The book was lost in 1865. We have no idea who's in those graves. All graves are unidentified. Here's the plaque from the Florence National Cemetery. Talks about the burials. And this, everybody, okay. And this is the sort of a distant, you can see where the rows are on either side of the marker. And those are little markers that indicate how many are buried in that vicinity. And there's a close-up of it. And today, I'm happy to say that they've got the names of most of them. There are scholars who are spending their time going through all these Union records, Confederate records, to find out, who was at Florence and who died there. And John Morrison is now on the list to be commemorated. And I want to thank you for your attention. You have any questions? How we're doing this time. Well, almost took away most of your time. I'm sorry. I talk too much. I'll be happy to answer any questions after the next talk. But is there some here I can? We've got a little bit. There were escapes from Andersonville, right? Most of them were not. You always hear about tunnels and things, but most of them were trustees who got away. Not many. It was a very hard area of Georgia to get away from, very wild, and the Confederates maintained a very excellent pack of bloodhounds. So not very many at all escaped.
You mentioned after the Battle of Bryce Crossroads that the 9th Minnesota was fighting or fleeing with colored infantry.
Yes.
Did they fight?
Oh yes, absolutely, alongside. Absolutely they did. The colored infantry did extremely well. 55th and 59th. In fact, my book quotes the Minnesotans saying, "God bless the brave blacks." They fought extremely well. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have a list of the men who served in the 9th?
I have a list of the casualties, because that's where they worked from. There are published lists in Minnesota, Civil and Indian Wars, and other places, but unfortunately they're not complete. That's one thing I was hoping the 150th anniversary would do, would be to get people to really work through these lists. I had to reconstruct this from going from a casualty list and then working from that. But if the published lists are not complete by any means, and many of them are wrong spelling. They omit people. So that's something that needs to be done for each regiment. I'm hoping someday I can put a website up of all this information on the 9th Minnesota's prisoners, indicate what I know what happened to them. Are there any other questions? Yes?
How many people actually survived the camp?
Well, there was a fair number. Of 45,000 went through there. You know, they were nearly 13,000 dead. They're not really certain because they don't really have records for the whole camp of who went through. But Andersonville is the best documented camp of all of the camps. They actually captured a lot of the records at the end of the war. But there are people that are trying to figure out who was there and who wasn't. But most people survived. I mean, the 9th Minnesota's death rate was much higher than others. And I think it was because these fellas had never been tested up to that point. They hadn't made any hard marches. They hadn't been weeded out. That was the reason, I think. But their death rate was so remarkable that others noticed it. Other prisoners noticed and said, these guys are dying for reasons I don't understand. So any other questions? Well, thank you very, very much.